We're kind of like the two most unlikeliest of friends with our backgrounds. Toby's one of the world's leading authority advocating for increased MRI regulations because they're so lax and that they contribute to a lot of bad outcomes. And I'm in the RCA business and the reliability engineering business, and we worked on some cases together where, you know, he's the SME and I'm just the guy who puts the structured logic and the storytelling together. How many people were here 2 years ago? Do you remember the case that we did then? What was it about? Yes.
Bonus points.
Good recollection. Thank you. It was a very unfortunate case, and we hope that when we do these cases, that we're not scaring people as much as making people more aware. In that particular case, there was a 6-year-old boy named Michael Colombini who was getting an MRI because of an accident that he had had. And through a series of errors and well-intentioned people, a metal canister was brought into the MRI suite during the scan, and it essentially became a missile and went into the tunnel where the little boy was. And you know, the attempt of these is to go ahead and learn from these particular cases and to make people more aware. This is going to be another case that we're going to go through, but Toby's going to let us know about the statistics in the medical industry for these MRI incidents and the lack of regulation. For those who don't know me, I've spent about 25 years doing this in RCAs and hospitals, and there's one thing that I got out of that: stay healthy. when you know what goes on behind the curtain, and I'm not saying that to be derogatory to the staffs, because I mean they're caregivers and they're in a world where the systems are lacking. And that's what we do in our businesses, is that we try to make the systems better for the people to make better decisions. Okay, all of this stuff is in your program. We don't want to take up too much oxygen with the who we are kind of stuff. And I'm going to turn this over to Toby, and he's going to give you background, and then I'll get into case.
Thank you, Bob. So we're going to I give the name of the hospital. The name of the hospital really is irrelevant. Like so many MRI accidents, this one was not telegraphed in terms of, oh my God, there's a dangerous situation, right? This is something that appeared very commonplace, very benign, and then it went sideways really quickly, right? A woman shows up in the emergency room, and emergency room docs, being who they are, love the donuts of truth. CT scanners, MRI scanners, depending on what the potential diagnosis is, they refer patients to get scans all the time. Nowadays, it's actually fairly infrequent that you go into and then exit the emergency department without getting a scan of some flavor, right? So this woman shows up at the emergency room, and the emergency room doc says, you need an MRI. And they call up MRI, hey, can you squeeze in an emergency room patient? This particular hospital only had one MRI scanner. And during the day, it was booked with their outpatients. And they're like, well, we have a patient in the scanner right now. When you say, emergency department, this patient needs an MRI, do I need to stop this scan and pull the patient who's in there right now out so we can, is this a stat? And they said, no, not a stat. But we want to just clear up some diagnoses before we discharge this patient. And they're like, well, you know, how about we schedule this patient in an hour? Great. Emergency department says, we'll send her in an hour. Fantastic. Hour comes and goes, no patient shows up. About an hour and 20 minutes in, when they're sitting there and they've got an empty MRI scanner and they've rejiggered their schedule to accommodate this ER patient, the MRI calls to the emergency department and says, you guys were supposed to send this patient 20 minutes ago. We're holding an empty slot for you. Where is your patient? And they said, oh, did nobody tell you? Yeah, no, this patient was admitted and they were sent up to the floors. And so they're in a patient room upstairs somewhere. Well, you told the floor, right, that this patient had a scheduled MRI. I'm sure somebody did. So they call up to the floor, and of course, nobody on the floors, none of the nurses or doctors knows anything about a scheduled MRI, and they're like, you know, we're sorry, we're gonna have to schedule this for later. The physician really wants this. Can you find us a new second hole in your schedule? Oh, sure, no problem. We'll just reschedule our entire workload for the day after already being behind now because we carved out this empty slot that nobody ever showed up for. So the appointed time arrives for the second scheduled MRI, and the patient is coming down. This is a recreation of the floor plan of that MRI suite. At the bottom, there's a shared radiology corridor. Depending on which door you go into off of that corridor, you may go into the CT suite, you may go into ultrasound rooms or the X-ray or fluoroscopy rooms. One of those doors brings you into the MRI suite. A couple of important players in this. We have the radiologic technologist, the MRI tech in the brown square, and they have a tech aide in the green square. Now, they get the call, our patient's coming down from the floors, they're already backed up. The rad tech is gonna do everything possible to expedite this. So she goes into the MRI room. This particular MRI scanner has what we call an undockable table. It detaches from the actual scanner. So you can load the patient on outside the room and roll that table in and essentially plug it into the scanner, and it operates just as one unified piece of equipment. So they know that the patient's coming down, they know they're gonna have to transfer this patient onto the MRI table. So the tech undocks it and essentially positions it so it's a straight shot through the door. So when the patient comes in on the regular hospital bed, they can just do a horizontal transfer onto the MRI bed. Once you pull it out of the room, slide it back in the room, scan the patient, no big deal. Patient arrives with a nurse and the ICU patient. Patient was admitted to ICU, and then a nurse's aide accompanying. The rad tech goes and opens the door. There's a doorbell or something indicating that the patient has arrived. Rad tech goes, opens the door. The nurse, the patient, and the nurse's aide come in. Very important workflow feature here. The rad tech, the MRI tech, can't do anything to initiate the study until they tell the electronic medical record system that the patient has arrived in MRI. In order to do that, the rad tech has to go into the control room, which, as you can see, the walls and the door essentially separate that from the patient transfer area. So the rad tech no longer has any visualization of what's going on in there. Rad tech goes into the control room to register the patient as having arrived in MRI, and the nurse proceeds to take the patient in on the ICU bed. Now, an MRI's magnetic field is 24/7, 365. It does not shut off. The nurse gets this giant 300-pound steel ICU bed within a handful of feet of the MRI scanner, and that happens. And the nurse finds herself pinned in between the ICU bed and the MRI scanner. This is the picture. We presume this was taken some hours afterwards. It kind of suggests that somehow we were stuffing the nurse into the tube, right? So that in the background is the MRI scanner, and then there's the ICU bed clearly being sucked up in it, magnetically attracted in it. We don't think that that's actually sort of what it looked like when the accident was happening. We think probably looked something like this. And the nurse wound up with deep lacerations and penetrating injuries, essentially from the upper right quadrant of her abdomen in a more or less straight line down to her lower left thigh. She had to go into surgery, and they removed broken off bits of the ICU bed that were stuck inside of her. from this accident. If you look at the image of where the nurse was, how do you get the nurse out from that position? Now there is, I said, the magnetic field of an MRI is 24/7, 365. Generally speaking, that's true. There is a button you can push that's called a quench button that de-energizes the MRI's magnetic field. It's not without its own risks associated with it. But the rad tech felt as though, or believed that she needed to get external approval to hit that big red button. And so instead, she goes to the nurse who's pinned between the ICU bed and the MRI scanner, and I choose my words carefully, grabs her by the arm and rips her out from between the ICU bed and the MRI scanner. This is the FDA adverse event report for this specific accident. And if you were under the impression that the FDA reports are to promote patient safety, I'm here to disabuse you of that fallacy. FDA adverse event reports are manufacturer compliance reports. They are not patient safety reports, which should be evident by the sum total of the description of this accident, which is 2 sentences long. It was reported that a hospital bed was taken into the scan room when it became attracted to the magnet. A staff member sustained injuries which required medical treatment. Doesn't even connect those two statements. Doesn't say that the injury was a result of the other thing. Two things happened. Something went flying at the magnet, and somebody was injured that required treatment. This isn't even a full statement of the outcomes, much less decisions that led to the outcomes, much less the environment in which those decisions were made, much less work as planned. What was the model of work? None of that is in here. Now, we were able, through some personal investigations, this adverse event got classified as an immediate jeopardy adverse event, which means it's escalated to an investigation. In this particular case, the state investigation was taken over by CMS, Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services. They're the folks who run Medicare and Medicaid. If your hospital or imaging center provides service to a Medicare patient, these are the folks who write you the check for that. Now they have what are called conditions of participation, basic requirements for quality and safety. And that empowers them to do investigations. So CMS did an investigation. In addition to that, because there was a workplace injury, OSHA did a second independent investigation to this particular accident. So we were able to pull quite a bit of information from these two formal reports in addition to the direct personal investigation that we did. Now, I'm about to switch gears, and I'm about to go from this specific accident to sort of big picture MRI safety that Bob alluded to. And it's dangerous to kind of draw inferences when your N is 1. And I'm going to make the argument that this particular accident doesn't prove a bigger climate of safety problem, but it is an example of that. So what does drift look like? Because I'm about to make some arguments about drift applied profession-wide in MRI, right? If we're looking at quality of performance, right, over time, maybe the quality of performance gets bad. Maybe if something really bad happens as a result of poor performance, maybe we correct it, right? We do a better job. But what if nobody ever really identifies what the root causes are? What if we never institutionalize the corrective actions or the better model of work? It just becomes a sugar high, right? At some point, when nothing catastrophic happens again, what happens to this curve? Down. We drop, right? So this is quality of performance. This is what the curve looks like, a drift curve looks like when we measure quality of performance. What if instead of measuring quality of performance, what if we were measuring frequency of adverse events over time? Well, maybe that would be exactly the same thing, only we flip it upside down, right? I want you to remember the shape roughly, because I'm going to relate it to this. This is a longitudinal study, evaluation of changes in the number of MRI studies that we do using the year 2000 as a baseline. The blue line is changes in the number of MRI procedures done annually in the US. The red line is the number of MRI classified adverse events in the United States. Changes from the year 2000. Remember this shape? That was not hypothetical. That is the shape of the early part of this curve. Why do I call our attention to the early part of this curve? Because Bob talked about our last presentation where we talked about the Columbini accident. The Columbini accident occurred in 2001, and in 2002, we got a best practice safety document. So there was an adverse event that captured the attention of the profession, and the following year we got an instruction manual on how to practice more safely. And for the 2 years that followed, we saw marked improvement in the reduction of MRI classified adverse event rates. None of those best practices from the instruction manual were codified into accreditation criteria or conditions of participation for CMS or any state licensure laws. So what happened? Well, after that, we saw a very substantial increase year after year. Now, thankfully, the number of MRI adverse events it's a relatively small number. So if you look at it longitudinally, the data is kind of noisy. So if we try and clean it up and we do linear regressions of the two data sets, this is what the linear regressions look like. The blue line is change in MRI procedure volume. The red line is MRI classified adverse events. The slope of the red line is almost 3 times the slope of the blue line. In English, what does that mean? For every 1% increase in MRI procedure volume, we would expect to see a 3% increase in MRI accidents. The more experience we have with this modality, the worse we do. Now, that's not because we're slacking off more and more year after year. It's that the risk profile for MRI is changing and growing year over year. So it's not a static condition and we are declining. It is an increasing risk condition and we're just not improving fast enough. So Bob's going to talk a little bit about what we found in this specific accident.
Thank you, sir. I want to start off with the fact that when we talk about HOP and learning teams and RCA, that we all have unity in purpose. And that from the standpoint of all major RCA providers, that we see all of these tools as complementing each other and not contradicting or competing with each other. So in this particular case, I'm going to show you an expression. I've owned my own company for 37 years, have been in this investigation business, and these are the tools that we use. I want to describe quickly, because I'm going to be running out of time here, but about the logic tree tool I'm going to be showing you that we use for graphical expression, is that when I look at where a failure comes from, if you look at the bottom here, this is really our management systems. However, that's just a listing of them, but some of them. So these are the systems that people rely on to make better decisions. When those systems, and I'm going to relate that to Swiss cheese here in a minute, because you're never going to have American cheese because you're always going to have those holes in it. So in this case, when we have poor systems and people rely on them, they make decisions that could have been better. As a result of making that decision, they trigger a series of observable cause and effect relationships, okay? So when we're going through it, because I can't see how people reason, but when I take an action and I do a checklist or I turn a button and something happens, these are things that I can see. If we don't stop that chain from occurring, then we have an undesirable outcome. And that's when all the suits show up, because you've hit a threshold of something, and now the upper level people are coming down. If I have a near miss, what's likely is in your organizations, if you have a near miss, is it a choice that you have to do an RCA or not? Because you didn't suffer a consequence. How many people say that you probably wouldn't do an RCA if there was not a consequence or a threshold? Because it's a lot of work to do an RCA, right? And if I don't have to do it, I'm not going to do it. The only point I want to make with this is that for a near miss, it would probably have to have been a high potential severity, is that if we choose not to go through there and do this, everything beneath that, from those systems on up, that string that is occurring will occur again. It might be somebody else who triggers it, but the roots are still there. For my purposes, labeling, call it whatever you want, as long as we do something about it, but all of those organizational things are latent roots. They're paper. Worst you're going to get out of these is a paper cut. They have to be activated by a human being. We refer to the act of decision making as the human roots, and then the observable consequences are going to be the physical. So we make decisions based on systems. As a result of those decisions, we trigger consequences. I call this my hourglass method, and it's going to make sense in the tree I'm going to show you. Everything revolves around the decision, the decision maker. You see the H in the middle is the human. Everything above that deals with the physical sciences. Everything beneath that deals with the social sciences. I hope I can use these words without being offensive, but I come from an engineering world. It's about as left brain as you can get, but engineers excel at the physical sciences. Engineers suck at the social sciences. And I will turn that around, because social scientists suck at physics. So it's the same thing. That this is what attracted me to this community, is the fact that most people look at RCA and think that it's a broken parts kind of thing, is that they don't go deep enough into the human side. So the blue part here is the bolt-on, and it's what attracted me to this community of getting deeper than the broken stuff and understanding why good people make bad decisions. If you're doing an RCA for the decision outcome, it's probably going to be a shallow cause analysis, not a root cause analysis. Unless you're seeking out decision intent, that's the purpose of a root cause analysis. You'll see as I go through this case that when you're going through the physics of failure, we ask the question, how could something happen? Because physics is very limited, doesn't change much. When you get down into the human stuff, we're exploring the reasoning, why it made sense at the time. All right, some people are fans of Swiss cheese model, some aren't. I'm a fan with a modification. This was back in 1990 by James Reasons. I love still using the metaphor. Each slice of cheese represents some kind of defense mechanism. All the holes are vulnerabilities. As 1990s, a long time ago, this gives people the impression that failure is linear, and failure is not linear. We talk about complexity over the decades, and things have just become more complex with technology. So it's not like that anymore. It's not, failure is not linear. Multiple things happen at the same time, and our defenses will either catch them or they won't. The cheese is getting bigger. The cheese is getting smaller. The holes are moving. The diameters are getting bigger and smaller. So it's a complex environment that we're trying to capture and prevent these things, the holes in the cheese, from lining up. I know several people in here from Texas, but how many people remember the Texas City refinery explosion? It's 2005, 15 contractors were killed. This phrase came out of that report, and it was called the Baker Report. And it was called, they said essentially what happened in this case was that people forgot to be afraid. And after that report came out is when I started making this chart and saying that when we're time pressured to do anything, what do? When we're time pressured to do anything. Shortcuts, right? And when you take a shortcut and nothing bad happens, what does that mean? You've just eroded the standard, right? And we all heard the term normalization of deviance, which came from the Space Shuttle Challenger investigation. So now you're getting a little comfortable, right? We took a shortcut, nothing bad happened, so what does that mean we're going to do? We're going to keep doing that. And eventually we're going to go through an invisible boundary because we have, as human beings, we have a tendency to ride the edges of the risk, towards the edges of the risk. And eventually we're going to run into that unsafe zone and we're going to have an accident. And then, Toby showed you how that happens in terms of performance. Now, this is drift in the sense of, he was looking at over 20 years of MRI. This is drift in behavior that we become used to. We forget to be afraid. And as we continually would go down with the boiling frog concept, we forget to be afraid, and then all of a sudden we get bit. So I think that the purpose, and I think we can all agree on this, is that how do you combat that? And that's what this, everything about, I know that about HOP and learning teams and RCA, is the fact that less than adequate supervisory oversight. If we let people get away with these shortcuts, then we're just as guilty as them because we're opening the door. We're giving them pats on the back for increasing production of whatever that might be. Okay, I'm going to start what we do as a graphical expression of and this is our storytelling tool. In this case, the event is going to work, level to level is going to be a cause and effect relationship. The event was that we had a MRI sentinel event resulting in a nurse injury. Sentinel event is a regulatory term in healthcare, which means that it passed a threshold by a regulatory agency that you had to do RCA. The two modes in this case that had to be present is that the nurse was pinned between the bed and the MRI, and we were pulling her out, which made the harm worse. So those combined together caused the event to occur, the sentinel event. So I'm going to go down the first leg first and say about the response. Oh, I did, let's see. I put a box on there. Those paper clips, this is an ongoing investigation that we haven't finished yet. But what I wanted to show you is that those paper clips represent firm evidence, hard evidence, whether these blocks are going to be true or not. And in this case, I'm just showing that report that the FDA put out that was really a shallow cause report. All right, so I'm coming down here and I'm going to go through the less than adequate response. They didn't quench, and they forcibly removed the nurse from the bed. They didn't quench, as Toby told you. There was a technologist chose to not quench the magnet, believing that they needed approval to do so. So as I go down from that decision, I'm going to look at there was less than adequate guidance on the quench authority. They didn't think they had the authority to do it, so therefore they didn't do it. And then I'm not going to get into the corrective actions that Toby's working on. All right, let's go down the bigger leg of this now, and it says the nurse was pinned, and I'm going to say, how could that happen? Well, the ICU bed had to be in zone 4, and the MRI machine had to be on. That's what I needed for that to happen. So I come down from there and say, how could the ICU bed end up in zone 4? Well, a nurse came in with that bed from zone 3. Now these are where it takes away the linearity argument, is that at this particular level here, we're going to say, well, why did the nurse bring the bed from zone 3 into zone 4? Well, the ICU, she entered zone 3with the patient. The rad tech informed the ICU nurse that the patient will have to go in head first, so that determined the direction of the bed would go in, which is not unusual, it's just a contributing factor. The MRI tech goes into the control room, as Toby told you, and they had to turn their back on where the bed was to take care of the paperwork to get them started. Okay, nothing unusual. The nurse who was bringing the patient in was not qualified to be in that position, to be doing that. The door to zone 4 was left wide open. So imagine you're going through the 2-door system and you got the bed, somebody's buzzing you in, and then the door's wide open. It makes perfect sense to go right on through. And then at last, we still don't have a firm answer on whether the ferromagnetic detector was on, off, or broken. So let's go through the one to the left and say, how did the nurse get into zone 3? Remember these, because these 6 things in a row we'll talk about. The ICU nurse goes into zone 3 with the patient. Why? Because they buzzed her in. The rad tech had to give them access, so they're buzzed in. It's almost like ringing the doorbell, and they say, okay, come on in. The ICU nurse arrives via the ICU RN arrives to the MRI suite through the zone 2. The nuts and bolts of this is that there was a zone 1, there was a zone 2, and there was supposed to be a zone 1. Zone 1 is just like the public hallway we all go into a hospital. This hospital didn't have that. They didn't have an area to prepare the patient to be able to go from an ICU bed to an MRI bed and to be able to go into that zone 4 area. Okay. This is just more that we took the depositions and the interview statements from the federal investigations and be able to say whether people actively did something or didn't do something or observed something. Okay, there was no transfer of the conventional hospital bed to the MRI safe bed, and the reasons for this is that they do not meet the intent of, what was ACR again?
American College of Radiology.
All right, the American College of Radiology is like the best practices in the world. So most of the regulatory agencies follow them except the Joint Commission. So these best practices were not being followed, but they were also not required by the regulatory agency of Centers for Medicare and Medicaid. So what does that mean when you say somebody, well, you know, they were supposed to move the patient from here to there, and they didn't do that? They didn't have to, right? I mean, if there's not a requirement to do it, and I haven't been doing it, then I'm probably not going to do it. And then with the, okay, I got those two. We're going down that the nurse did not have the proper credentials to be in the area. Why was that? The Joint Commission minimum diagnostic imaging standards do not require her to have that training. Only the MRI techs get the training, not the people who are not in the MRI suite. Doesn't make sense, because you would think that I'm going to provide that training to anybody who goes into the MRI suite. Okay, going down the next one. The MRI, excuse me, I'm blind. The clinical director of the MRI suite is supposed to provide the training that people need. In this particular case, this doctor didn't even think it was his job. So there was ambiguity as to who is supposed to provide the training. So therefore, nobody got training.
And if I can jump in there for 1 second.
Sure.
If this happened across the hall for a nuclear medicine service, nuclear medicine, they're actually, NRC has specific requirements. If you're going to get a radioactive materials license, you have to have a physician designated as the physician overseer for safety. You have to have a radiation safety officer. You have to have a radiation safety committee. Has to meet quarterly. You have to maintain records. You have to have performance criteria. There's an entire structure for safety, for the process that happens across the hall if it involves ionizing radiation. But in MRI, because it doesn't use, Godzilla creating radiation, none of those structures are minimum mandatories. So in this particular institution, there was ambiguity about even which doctor was supposed to be in charge of the safety of this service. And there was a lot of, not my job, it's his job, arguing and pointing in the investigative reports.
Okay, in this particular case, the nurse did not have the level of training she needed to be in that area, and we say why. There's no site-specific training on MRI safety practices at that point of care, and no radiology supervisor sign-off or competencies. There was no oversight that was checking that. So these systems were not apparent, therefore they didn't violate anything, right? If the system wasn't there, you weren't violating it. I'm going to go down the blue one there just because to make a point. Why did they feel that way? The facility had overly optimistic sense of MRI safety because the physicists had done, a year earlier, they had done an audit and they gave them a perfect score. So therefore they say, well, we must be really good because we got this perfect score. So that's an error of overconfidence. All right. The training materials that they were using, when we took a look at level 1 or level 2 training, it was the exact same materials. So there was no difference between level 1 and level 2. All right, showing you that on that 6th row, we're coming down number 5, why was the door left open to zone 4? When he showed you that animation, he showed you where the bed that was detached, which way did it move? It moved to the left and wedged against the door because there was such a tight space and it held the door open. So that when they came in with the bed, the ICU bed, not the MRI bed, they just figured that, it's a straight shot. I go right on in. The MRI, detaching the MRI table is done all the time, so that's it's a contributing factor, but it's not a cause. So this was a variance from the documented policy, but it was done frequently and known. When you see things like this and these behaviors that people have, what's the first thing that runs into your mind to say, is this a one-off? Is this a one-off, or do you think they do this all the time? If I'm that comfortable, going through the door because it's open, and I've gotten these habits and people that I work for are probably watching me. I've done this before. Other shifts have done this before. So this was a deviation from the policy, but it was done constantly without any consequence. Poor physical design of the MRI suite. It shouldn't be that tight where when you move the bed from the MRI into the door, that it wedges the door open. They were supposed to take the MRI bed out and move it into that zone 3 and transfer the patient from the ICU bed to an MRI safe bed. They did not do that. Okay, more evidence of those paper clips that I was talking about. All right, and the ferromagnetic detectors, they're dotted lines saying they're hypotheses because we still don't have certainty in the evidence whether they were operational or not working. All right, I'm going to end with this and give the rest to Toby, but this is what the scenario looks like in totality, and this is our storytelling tool, to be able to go down, tell this story, and if anybody questions the logic on anything, you just click on that, and the paper clip comes up and says, this was the evidence, this was when it was done, this was when it was, this is who did it. Now, with my great PowerPoint skills, I put holes of cheese in here. And what I wanted to be able to show here is I put a hole on all of the systemic roots that were identified in this case. And that's identifying that on this day, those are the vulnerabilities in the Swiss cheese, right? On this day, all of those things converged and were able to cause that accident to happen. And if we go through and we start to fill the holes in the cheese, we're going to reduce the chances of this type of thing happening, not only in this case, but across the board. because systems aren't made for one person or just a particular group. And my parting sentence here, if I had done 5 whys, how many people here know what 5 whys is? All right, we'll give you a lesson in 30 seconds. You ask yourself why 5 times. So in this particular case, if I'd have done 5 whys, what would I have missed? I don't know how many pieces of the holes I put here, but if there's 13 holes here and I found one of them, I missed 12. Okay? And that's, I'll give this to Toby now, but that's when people characterize RCA as having the capability of only the 5 whys, the 5 whys is linear. It finds one root cause, and it's very narrow in its questioning. The word why by itself insinuates that I want an opinion and a singular answer, which adds to the linearity. If you believe that that's what RCA is, then you're right, RCA does suck, okay? But because that's not the way in the world that we practice, for all of us practitioners in this room, it's much more comprehensive than that. It does take into account the human and the system's contributions to these things. So I wanted to be able to show that through this particular case.
Thank you, sir. So as a means of segue, we're going to move from sort of the systems level thinking for this particular accident back to my big picture MRI safety systems level, right? One of the things that just absolutely rubs me the wrong way is when these accidents get described as freak accidents. Here's a wheelchair, 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 here's a power wheelchair, here's a wheelchair, here's a wheelchair. Here are a couple of guys staring at the wheelchair going, oops, we did it again, right? This is just a partial selection from my photo library of MRI accidents, right? And I narrowed it just to the wheelchairs. Something that happens with this degree of regularity and foreseeability, how on earth can we justify calling these freak accidents? We know exactly how they happen. We know exactly the objects that are at risk, and these are just projectile accidents. I'll talk briefly about other categories of accidents. The big dog in healthcare space is CMS. CMS essentially sets the tenor for all regulation in healthcare. Why? Because more than 90% of the providers, at least of radiologic services, whether that's hospital or outpatient imaging, more than 90% of the providers participate in Medicare and Medicaid. They get paid for providing services to Medicare and Medicaid. And CMS has these conditions of participation, essentially minimum standards for this. And this is actually the enabling legislation. I just want to zero in on 2 statements, right? 2 conditions of participation. This is for hospitals. There's a separate set of rules and regulations for outpatient imaging centers. But for hospitals, for radiology services, including MRI, must meet professionally approved standards for safety and must be free from hazards or, for patients or personnel. Professionally approved standards, you must follow professionally approved standards, and the environment must be free of hazards. If in your workplace, your business, I said, I am the regulator, and I tell you that you absolutely must comply with the professionally approved standards for your industry, what would a reasonable first question back to me be? Where are the standards? Which standards? You're telling me I must follow them. Okay, which ones do you acknowledge as industry professionally approved standards? CMS won't tell you. It's a legal requirement that hospitals have to follow professionally approved standards, but CMS says, yeah, if we actually formally acknowledge it, we have to go through this really difficult and painful, long and drawn out rulemaking process, and we just don't want to do that. So we will hold you to that standard retrospectively, whichever standard we want to pull out of the drawer, if we come and slap your hand because you did something wrong. But we won't tell you prospectively what that standard is. You're in this industry, you should know, right?
If you can't tell, Toby has a tense relationship with the Center for Medicare and Medicaid.
Free from hazards. So we did wheelchairs. Let's do everything else. Here's one of the knee scooters. Here's a pistol. Here's an IV pole with a medication pump. That is a bassinet carrier. What goes in a bassinet? A newborn baby. That's a ventilator. That's a desk chair from the console. There's another ventilator. There's an IV pole. There's an anesthesia cart. There's a bedside table. Somebody wanted the patient to have a bedside table so they could, I don't know, read their Kindle while they're getting their knee MRI. Difficult to see because they've got like washcloths over them. Those are 2 more pistols. That's a device that's supposed to make infusion pumps safe in MRI. And the infusion pumps inside are not safe for MRI, and so the whole thing gets sucked to the MRI scanner. There's another bed. There's a materials stocking basket cart. There's a crib. What are the 2 obligations that CMS says? You must follow professionally approved standards, but we're not going to tell you what they are. And it must be an environment free of hazards for patients and personnel. Does that look like an environment free of hazards to patients or personnel? Now, I'm not suggesting that there's a magic wand out there that makes these environments free of hazards, but we can actually make them safer than they are if we apply existing best practices. MRI safety is, in theory, regulated, but in reality, there are little, if any, state licensure regulations that are specific to MRI and MRI safety for either patients or caregivers. And there's functionally nothing at the national level either. The accreditation organizations have be good, do safe, sort of general umbrella statements, but if you ask them specifically what are the practices that we're supposed to apply here, they're not very strong on those. Each and every one of the accidents, the main one that we did the root cause analysis on, and the litany of images that I showed you, and those are just projectile accidents. We also interfere with medical devices and cause pacemakers to stop functioning, cause insulin pumps to dump the entire contents of their reservoir into patients. We do all kinds of nasty things to implants and devices that aren't designed to be exposed to MRI safely. We burn patients. We produce hearing damage, auditory damage. These are all a product of an absence of standards. There is no standardized black line expectation of work relative to MRI safety in this industry. I don't care which state you're talking about. I don't care which accreditation organization you're talking about. With respect to MRI safety, there is no uniform model of safe delivery of care. Each individual facility is an island unto themselves. They get to decide what they do or don't want to do. One thing, I don't see Ben in the room. Ben Goodhart yesterday made a couple of statements, or the same statement a couple of times. And he said, complex systems, I'm paraphrasing, need more rules like I need another hole in my head. I disagree. Looking at a complex system that functionally has no rules, I really can't imagine a worse environment for delivery of patient care than someplace that essentially is a free-for-all. Whatever you think you want to do today is just fine and dandy. I think we need a qualitative set of rules. I would agree quantity is not the key feature, but we need to have at least one, and right now we really don't have that. So,
Anybody
very
have an MRI scheduled? Now you're a lot more aware. You know how to ask the questions now.
Toby, is there one question, if I'm getting an MRI, that I need to ask?
If you have questions about safety, the question that I personally would ask is, do you have somebody who is a designated MRI safety officer for this facility, this practice? If you don't have an individual who's responsible or accountable for safety, then the organization doesn't have safety. So ask about the accountable individual.
Thank you, gentlemen.